Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes pretty fast if you're the car chick. Now, here she is.
Welcome, everyone, to the Straight Shift. Today, we're going to talk about recalls. It seems that a day does not go by that we don't hear about some sort of recall affecting millions of vehicles, from everything from anti-lock brakes not working correctly to engines catching on fire. Seriously, there is never a dull moment in the automotive industry. But what exactly constitutes a recall for an automobile? How does that process work? How are they issued? What constitutes a recall versus just some other annoying problem? And what do you do if a recall has been issued on your vehicle? Or how do you know if one is even existing on your vehicle in the first place? So we're going to talk through all those things because recalls are so incredibly important to your safety and the safety of your family and the other drivers on the road. And we'll also hit on a couple of the biggest recalls in history just because that information is really interesting. So buckle your seatbelts. Here we go. And I apologize if the podcast is a little bit longer today, but we got to get through all this information because it's really important. Now, when any type of company manufactures any type of product, whether you're talking about cars or toys or medicine, they really need to create items that are safe. Now, this does not always happen, but it is essential to, the long-term value and the success of the corporation and the reputation of their brand. But hey, guess what? In the United States, it's also required by law. You got to protect the consumer. And while obviously we want everything to be perfect, the reality is nothing ever is, and defects do happen, especially when you're talking about a product as complicated as an automobile. So when a safety defect occurs, the auto manufacturers are supposed to initiate some sort of recall to address the problem. And most of these things are pretty simple and routine. You would be amazed at how many recalls are issued every day, sometimes for things that don't seem that important, but they are safety related. And so the manufacturers just work with their dealer partners to, come up with a fix, to train the dealers on how to fix it. And you just take your car in and, they're probably going to do an oil change anyway. Might as well get all the recall work done. It's a little bit inconvenient, but hey, they were proactive. They got your car fixed. Everybody is safe and happy on the road. But sometimes a recall is serious enough to have a lasting effect on that manufacturer or on the industry as a whole. And that usually is when it's a huge recall that affects a large number of vehicles, and the safety defect has resulted in serious injuries and even deaths, which of course automatically means extensive media coverage. And so this is why having, the manufacturers dealing with the recalls properly is so critically important to them. So in order to understand how this process works, we need to just look back a little bit into history and look at where did the concept of a recall even come from? The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, they were established back in 1970 as a part of the Highway Safety Act, and they're responsible for kind of overseeing the safety of the automotive and transportation world, including creating and enforcing the motor vehicle safety standards that exist in the United States. And we have by far the strictest safety requirements for automobiles than any other country in the world, which explains why cars are a little bit more expensive here sometimes, but hey, we're just trying to be safe. The manufacturers of the motor vehicles and all the parts that go into making an automobile, which, maybe in many cases, individual parts are made by third-party companies. They're not actually made by the auto manufacturer. They're, vendored out. But everybody involved in manufacturing car stuff is required by law to comply with these safety standards. And if a defect that does not meet said safety standards is identified, they are required to conduct a recall campaign. Sounds simple, right? Yeah, not so much. Over the first 20 years since this went into effect, recalls were relatively few and far between. They averaged about 95 recalls a year across all the automakers and the vehicles. But when we got to the mid 90s, recall activity just really jumped up. It started to go through the roof. And from about the mid 90s to around 2013 or so, the number of recalls almost doubled per year. And the reason for that is kind of multifaceted. Obviously, we were looking at an increase in just the number of cars on the road. More manufacturers entered the market, therefore, different makes and models were out there. So, naturally, just due to the numbers, you were going to see an increase in the recalls. Add to that, cars started getting more complicated. So, quite frankly, there were more opportunities for defects to occur. But honestly, the biggest impact to the identification of recalls has been the internet. It increased the ease and flow of information from consumers and dealerships back to the manufacturers. Because think about it, more recently with the advent of social media, the information is now flowing in a matter of seconds, not a matter of hours or days or weeks, back in the old days. So, the internet allowed consumers to, identify safety problems with their vehicles, complain about it to other people, and then get that information into the hands of the automakers. So, hey, sometimes the internet really does help us out and work in our favor. So when they had this access to information, it allowed them to be able to address it better, but it also put pressure on them to address it because now it was a lot easier for them to get bad PR. And despite the fact that we have this perception that there have been so many more recalls in recent years, with the exception of a couple of years that I'll talk about later, that really hasn't been true. The number of recalls across the board has remained fairly consistent since the mid 90s. But let's talk about what truly constitutes a recall. Not all reliability problems that crop up with a vehicle will result in a recall. A recall is strictly a safety issue. So if you're having a problem with your navigation system being a little wonky, that's not going to be addressed with a recall because it's not safety related. Technically, you might drive off a cliff, but really that's your fault, not the cars. But, a faulty airbag that, say, explodes in your face and detonates deadly shrapnel all through the car, yeah, that constitutes a safety issue and therefore a recall. So only defects that violate the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, and that's a very lengthy list of requirements, let me tell you, or one that poses an obvious unreasonable risk to safety, will rise to the level of a recall. If it is something that is just more of an annoying reliability problem, and there are bazillions of these on every vehicle, the manufacturers will often issue what's called a Technical Service Bulletin, or TSB. These are really kind of internal notes to the mechanics of the dealerships, and they also go into a TSB database that is accessible by independent mechanics so that they can also work on the vehicle. It just lets them know, hey, this has been a commonly identified problem with this vehicle. We know about it, and hopefully there's a fix, and they'll list what that fix is in the TSB. Sometimes there's not a fix yet because the problem's been identified, but they don't know what's causing the problem or how to fix it. But yeah, hey, we know about it. You're out of luck right now. Stay tuned for more information. But that's how they deal with just general reliability defects with the car. And that can be anything from mechanical issues to, the radio cutting out to the backup camera fritzing on you, just anything related to the car. But if it is safety related, then it can escalate to the level of a recall. And you would think that anytime one of those is identified, the manufacturers would go ahead and automatically issue a recall. No, they don't always do that. A lot of the manufacturers, yes, will go ahead and issue the recall when one is warranted. They want their products to be safe. They want their reputation of their brand to remain positive in the public eye. But recalls are expensive. And this is where you get into actuarial accounting, which basically takes, looks at how much is this going to cost us to fix this versus the risk of how many people are going to get hurt or die and therefore sue us, and that will cost us money, which is greater. Sometimes they'll just err on the side of taking a risk. But we hope that they don't do that. And fortunately, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, their job is to be the police of this. In 2016, the industry spent $22 billion on recalls. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how expensive it can be to fix these problems and why sometimes the that's hard to say, NHTSA has to force the issue with the manufacturers. As a consumer, really anyone can file a safety complaint with the administration, but it does have to be a safety complaint. They don't want to hear you complaining about your car's consuming too much oil or the rear DVD system's cutting out. It's got to be a safety issue. And you can also file a petition to open an investigation, and that's usually something that's done by insurance companies and lawyers when there has been, injuries or deaths involved. But I'm just going to call them the administration. That acronym's too long to say. The administration, they're going to look through these complaints. And when, there's just kind of a quorum or enough information that they're like, it really sounds like something hinky's going on here, they can open an investigation. And if the manufacturer doesn't do anything, they can force a recall through a court order. But that process is fairly involved and it can take, a year or two to get that going. But what they'll do is they'll start with an evaluation. They'll get information from the manufacturer and from all the parties involved, and they'll give the manufacturer the opportunity to kind of tell their side of the story. And if they find that enough evidence exists that, there probably is a safety defect here, then they're going to go to the step of doing an engineering analysis, which basically means they're going to collect more data. They're going to perform a whole bunch of scientific tests. They're going to do surveys. They're going to inspect vehicles that were involved in incidents. They're going to gather as much scientific data as possible. And then those investigators are going to submit their findings to a review panel. If the panel agrees, yep, there's a problem here, then the federal regulators will send a recall request to the manufacturer. They're going to give them every opportunity, to just volunteer to do the right thing. But if the manufacturer refuses to issue a recall, then they're going to convene a public meeting, literally like a town hall where the manufacturer, probably their lawyers, any third parties that are involved or interested, and the general public can literally show up and discuss and debate the issue. And if the participants in that meeting support a recall, then the administration's chief administrator has the legal authority to issue that court order, legally requiring the manufacturer to conduct a recall. Now, the manufacturer can technically challenge that ruling in federal court, but it rarely happens because let's face it, the bad press alone from that would cost them way more than just shutting up and dealing with the recall. So now that we know what a recall is, we're just going to take a really quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about two of the biggest and most expensive recalls in history, what was really the truth behind them, and which one is actually still causing problems to this day. And then I'll tell you how to find out if your vehicle is affected by a recall and what you should do about it. So I'll be right back after this. Do you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a great price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 704-248-8706. That's 704-248-8706. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
Ah, the Car Chick is back for more Straight Shift.
Welcome back to the Straight Shift. We're talking about recalls, those defects in a vehicle that can affect your safety and therefore rise to the legal definition of a recall. Some of the biggest recalls in history are famous. They're still going on. There's been a lot of really good ones over the years. It was actually kind of difficult. I could probably do a whole podcast just talking about some of these fantastic scandals that we've had over the years, but I wanted to pick the two biggest ones. Does anybody remember the infamous out of control gas pedals of about 10 years ago that caused the unanticipated acceleration in the Toyota Prius? I mean, honestly, people, it's a Prius, so any amount of acceleration is probably going to be unanticipated, but legit, there actually was a problem about this, and it affected 9 million Toyota and Lexus vehicles from 2004 up through, I think, about 2010, and it caused the gas pedal was sticking, and so the acceleration, the gas pedal was in the open position, and it was causing some runaway vehicle incidents. And the reason that this got so much press was for a couple of reasons. Number one, you just don't expect problems with Toyotas. Their reputation for reliability actually worked against them in this case. And there were some slightly sensational stories about some criminals who were claiming that, it was the Toyota problem. The car ran away from me. No, they had just committed a crime and were trying to get away, and they got caught, and they tried to blame it on the gas pedal on their Toyota. So there were a few incidents like that, which were fairly amusing, but unfortunately, there really was a legitimate problem. There were truly about 60 cases overall where investigators found, yes, there was a runaway vehicle problem because the gas pedal did get stuck open. And unfortunately, one of them did result in a death. And that's really what brought the administration down on Toyota's head. And the problem was exacerbated by Toyota's executives not handling it well with the American media. I think they really underestimated just how ruthless the American media and the American public can be when they jump on a juicy story. They knew that it was going to, sell newspapers and attract, viewers for news programs because you don't normally see in the news Toyota and some major problem. So the culture in Japan and across Asia in general is also very different. And the concept of saving face is extremely important to them. And so they really kind of tried to be standoffish. They tried to save face and not really talk about or admit that this problem existed, not realizing that was only adding fuel to the fire with the American media. So I think it was a major PR failure on their part. But, when the pressure came down and the administration, kind of forced them into a recall situation, they did do their job, and they looked at the problem and found that really what was causing the gas pedal to get stuck was that the floor mats, something as stupid as a floor mat was causing this problem. The mats had not been cut precisely to fit those vehicles. And so the mat would move around and it would get stuck on the gas pedal sometimes, holding down the gas pedal, hence runaway car. This is why I always preach to people that if you're going to get new floor mats for your car, whether you're getting new carpet mats because yours are worn out, or you want to switch over to the heavy-duty rubber floor mats, you do not simply go down to Walmart or your auto parts store and buy generic floor mats. You need to spend the money to buy floor mats that have been laser cut precisely for your specific vehicle. because of this reason. If floor mats are not precisely fit to the floor of your vehicle, they can move around. And when they can move around, they can get stuck on your pedals. So that's what this problem was. And Toyota ended up issuing 2 different recalls in 2009 and 2010 to kind of reconfigure the whole acceleration setup. So they changed the floor mats. They changed a little bit of the position of the gas pedal so that it was a little higher and it was harder for the mats to get stuck on them. But it ended up costing them over $5 billion because of floor mats. And one of the reasons it cost them so much was because they drugged their feet and they didn't handle it as well as they should have. And they blew a whole bunch of money that they didn't necessarily need to blow had they just dealt with the situation and figured it out in the first place. Because let's face it, floor mats, not that expensive. So that was a big lesson for Toyota and for all the automotive industry on how not to handle a recall. To date, that is the most costly recall in history, although that may change soon, but it certainly didn't affect nearly as many vehicles as a lot of other recalls. And the infamous Takata airbag recall, which, unless you have literally been living under a rock somewhere, you've probably heard of this, or maybe you've been living in Manhattan and you don't have a car anyway. But this is definitely the largest recall in history. It's affected about 70 million vehicles worldwide so far. It started in 2013, but guess what? It's still going on. Takata is a Japanese corporation, and they manufactured various different auto parts, including airbags and airbag parts across 4 different continents. This is a huge company, and the airbags in question, and really the inflator component of an airbag. When an airbag inflates, it's like a little tiny rocket launching behind your dashboard or wherever the airbag is. They use a chemical propellant, basically a small explosion, to cause the airbag to deploy in the event of a crash. And what was happening was sometimes the airbag itself would rupture because the inflator, it didn't just deploy, it detonated. And the airbag would rupture and shrapnel would go flying around the cockpit of the vehicle, injuring and in several cases killing the occupants that it was supposed to protect. So they've been manufacturing airbags since 1988. You'd think that they would have gotten it figured out by then, because by the time this recall reared its ugly head, they held over 20% of the global market. So that's why so many millions and millions and millions of vehicles worldwide were experiencing this problem. And Honda was the first manufacturer to identify this problem, partly because Honda globally is one of the big vehicles, but they began issuing a recall of their vehicles voluntarily because they discovered that they had several cases where, it was about over 100 cases where serious injuries had resulted, and a total of 13 documented deaths at that point had happened because of the airbags. And so, Honda really jumped on this, kudos to them. And of course, it was Takata's fault because they were the manufacturer of the airbag. Honda didn't have any control over that. And Takata initially admitted that their Mexican subsidiary, because the airbags were made at their plant in Mexico, that they had screwed up the manufacture of the explosive propellants and the chemicals that are used to deploy the airbags. They believed that the problem was that excessive moisture and humidity was getting into those chemicals and changing their properties and causing them to deploy and basically detonate incorrectly. But they didn't really know which vehicles were going to be affected because their parent company kept really crappy records. So they didn't have a link to be able to trace which of these airbags ended up in which vehicles worldwide. They just kind of shipped them out and said, hey, here's an airbag, put it whatever you want it, in any vehicle. So there wasn't a link to adequately trace them. Usually in the manufacturing process and the assembly of cars, every single part, every bolt, every screw, every panel, everything, has a serial number on that part, and which VIN number that part got put on, so you know exactly which parts were on what cars, or at least what batches of manufactured parts went on what cars. And that's how they can identify if there is a faulty part, which cars exactly down to the VIN numbers are affected by that. This did not happen because Takata did not keep stupid records. And so by the next year, end of 2014, more injuries, including the death of a pregnant woman and her baby due to the airbag shrapnel. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration ordered Takata to issue a nationwide recall. And further investigation found that, guess what? Takata had known about the problem, or the potential for the problem, long before 2013, long before it became public knowledge and these incidents actually started happening. So they got slapped with a fine for $200 million for being irresponsible corporate jerks. But it gets even better. In 2016, a truck that was actually transporting these airbag parts itself was involved in a crash, resulting in the entire cargo of these airbags to explode, engulfing a house and killing the poor woman who was inside. So you didn't even have to have the airbags installed inside cars for them to be weapons of mass destruction. So the next January, the federal government actually issued criminal charges against 3 Takata executives for their negligence and the intentional cover-up of this situation. And they pled guilty and agreed to pay $1 billion in fines to cover things like victim compensation, compensating the auto manufacturers for all the repairs they had to do, and to cover the cost of the federal investigation. Other governments around the world quickly followed as best they could within their laws. And by June of 2017, Takata filed bankruptcy. Now, they were purchased for pennies on the dollar by another company called Key Safety Systems. But I'm really wondering if Key Safety Systems is starting to regret that purchase, because the problems are persisting. Even as recently as this past March 2019, Honda just issued another recall of over 1 million more vehicles after they found a crash involving a 2004 Honda Odyssey that had one of the replacement airbags that was supposed to fix the problem. That airbag ruptured. Fortunately, it only bruised the arm of the driver, but it still ruptured for the same reason. So the replacement airbags that it took Takata forever to get out to the manufacturers, they used a different chemical propellant that was supposed to not be as, affected by or vulnerable to moisture and humidity. Well, that didn't work either. So there have been problems starting to crop up now with the replacement airbags. This is ridiculous. And it's not even Takata's first major recall and scandal. Back in the mid-90s, they made a bunch of defective seat belts that the locking mechanism didn't work properly, and it actually could trap the driver and passengers in the car because the seatbelt truly locked and would not unlock. And in an accident, that can be extremely dangerous. You want the seatbelt to hold you in and keep you in the car and restrained as much as possible in an accident. But then you want to be able to unlock the seatbelt and get out of the car, especially if it's on fire. So that caused a humongous scandal, and they ended up recalling over 8 million vehicles at a cost of $1 billion back in the mid-90s. But, of course, only after a 9-month investigation by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So, bottom line, Takata as a corporation sucks. They make defective products, and then they don't do their corporate responsibility of owning up to their mistakes and fixing them. So, they're bankrupt. They're going bye-bye. But the poor company that bought them is dealing with, new recalls continually being issued on the replacement airbags. So it's really scary to think that, any one of us could get into our car and, see, have an airbag, not do its job and protect us, but actually cause further injury or even put our lives at risk. So, You know, if your car was affected by the Takata airbag, and you got a replacement one, just keep your eye out. I mean, obviously, this is a great motivation for not getting in an accident, but be aware that this, another recall could be issued on your vehicle. And if you never got your vehicle taken care of in the first place, just Google Takata airbag recall and you'll come up with a website. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but you can put in your VIN number and it'll tell you if your vehicle was affected by it. But literally millions and millions and millions of vehicles worldwide have been affected. So in general, how do you know if a recall that has been issued affects your particular vehicle? Well, the auto manufacturer is required by law to send you a lovely first class letter via snail mail. And the envelope will have this big red banner on it saying important safety recall information. And it'll have the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration logo on it so that you know that it's legit. Some manufacturers will also try to reach you via email if they have it on file, but they are required to go by first class snail mail. So this is why it's really important for you to make sure that the auto manufacturer has your correct and up-to-date contact information. Most auto manufacturers, if you go to their website, there will be a tab or a link somewhere that says owners. And so if you own one of the vehicles, you can register your vehicle. The dealership will normally do this for you when you purchase a vehicle. That's one of the reasons that they get all this information from you. But it's a good idea to make sure that you have, your information is registered with the manufacturer and that information is up to date so they can reach you in the event a recall is issued for your vehicle. You can also go to the nhtsa.gov. That's the government website, and you can put in the VIN number for your car, and it will tell you if there are any open recalls for your vehicle. So that's a great way just to be on the safe side, just in case you may have missed a recall notice. If you realize that, there's an open recall on my vehicle, just call your dealership. Give them the VIN number and say, hey, I just found out there's a recall on my vehicle. If you have the recall number, every recall is issued, a unique identifier by the Highway Administration. Get that number for them, but they should be able to pull it up via your VIN number anyway, because they know what recalls have been issued for what vehicles, and just schedule an appointment to get the work handled. 9 times out of 10, it's not going to cost you any money. Unless your vehicle is over 15 years old and they've just now figured out that there's a safety defect with it and issued a recall, sometimes in that case, you might have to pay a little bit out of pocket, but most of the manufacturers are being really good about doing that and fixing it for free. And there's not a statute of limitations on it either. Once a recall is issued, they are required to fix it for the life of your vehicle. The only exception to that is tires. Tires, I think I have a 5-year window on getting things fixed just because tires deteriorate, after that time. So be sure that you stay up to date on the recalls. And, every now and then it's not a bad idea to run your VIN and just see, hey, did I miss anything? Is there anything important? Because it's your safety. It could be your life. Hopefully it won't be. Now, if you are looking at purchasing a vehicle, or if you're going to go rent a car, you also want to be certain that that vehicle is not affected by a recall, that the work has not been done to fix it. Now, auto dealers are prohibited by law from selling a new car that has an open recall. And believe it or not, recalls can get issued really, really fast, within the model year that is still new. Just ask Jeep. When the Grand Cherokee was redesigned a few years ago, I think they had about a dozen recalls in the first 2 months the vehicle was out. It was just ridiculous. But they're required to fix those before they can sell them as new cars. Now, there's no such protection for used cars or cars that you're buying from a private party, which by definition will be used. But most of the franchise dealers, your Honda stores, your Toyota stores, your Ford stores, the manufacturers will not allow them to sell a used vehicle of their brand on their lot that has an open recall. Back when the Takata airbag thing hit, because they could not manufacture replacement airbags fast enough to cover all of the cars, so many of the dealers, I remember my Honda guys were just pulling their hair out because they had all of these used Hondas and some new ones sitting on their lots for months that they couldn't sell because they were waiting for the dang airbag replacements to come in. So it was really frustrating for them. But, your independent dealerships and certainly private parties, they're not under anyone's thumb to not sell you a car that has an open recall. So it's up to you to do that homework. Get the vehicle's VIN number and run it through the Highway Safety Administration's website and just see if there are any open recalls on it. Most of the time that information will also be on the Carfax report. So that is one of the 30 odd pieces of data that I look for when I'm shopping for used cars for my clients. If there's an open recall, I'll run the VIN to see, has the recall been taken care of? If I have to, I'll call the customer service number for that automaker and be like, hey, here's a VIN number. I'm looking to purchase this car. Has this recall been taken care of or not? And if it hasn't, then you can require, or you can't require, but you can certainly request that the dealership get that recall work fixed before you agree to buy the car. Some will, some won't, but it's just always a good idea to know that that's out there. Fortunately, they recently passed a law that prevents rental car companies from renting out cars that have an open recall on them that has not been fixed. So you don't have to worry about renting, a potential death trap of a car. I hope this information has been helpful. I know we went a little bit over, but there's just so much to talk about with recalls, and they're so critically important because they do relate to your safety. And unfortunately, various recalls over the years have been serious enough that they have resulted in some deaths to innocent people. And that's always, always tragic. So stay on top of the recalls. Don't buy a car that has an open recall. And generally, folks, just drive safely.
The Straight Shift podcast is copyright LeeAnn Shattuck, The Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of LeeAnn Shattuck or The Car Chick.